Story that will unsettle the White House when it comes to the Mueller investigation. The Washington Post reporting tonight, just as we got on the air, that members of the Mueller probe have been advised that they will be, well, members of the Mueller probe have advised other people that they expect to be working on their current gig, the Mueller investigation, for much of 2018. If you've been following the president's confident assertions that this is all going to be over immediately, definitely by Thanksgiving, I mean Christmas, I mean New Year's, that news has got to be causing some agita tonight in the White House. We'll be talking with Washington Post reporter about that in just a moment. I also want to offer you one other piece of evidence, though, that the Trump team is having a little bit of a freak out right now as to what the Mueller investigation is doing. This lawyer was sent this weekend to two congressional committees apparently chosen at random by a lawyer for the Trump transition team. His name is Corey Langhofer. Mr. Langhofer says in his letter that Mueller's office has taken thousands and thousands of the transition team's emails without permission. He says he took them illegally. Even though the transition team wrote their emails using government-issued computers and devices, using .gov email addresses, the Trump transition lawyer is now saying that those emails that they sent, those were all private. Those were all private, and Mueller can't have them. The Trump transition lawyer also says that many of these emails, in his estimation, are protected by, quote, the attorney-client privilege, the deliberative process privilege, and the presidential communications privilege. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and statistically speaking, neither are you. But think about that for a second. This is for the transition, so Trump's not president. So he's claiming presidential privilege over stuff that happens before he's... I mean, there can't be presidential privilege if Donald Trump wasn't president yet, unless there's presidential privilege for the president of the Trump organization, right? It's not how it works. Counsel of the General Services Administration, which is the agency that provided these devices and email accounts to the transition, told BuzzFeed News this weekend that, quote, in using our devices, transition team members were informed that materials would not be held back in any law enforcement actions. Deputy counsel read to BuzzFeed News a series of agreements that anyone had to agree to when using GSA materials during the transition, including that there could be monitoring and auditing of the devices, and that, quote, therefore no expectation of privacy can be assumed. Apparently, all the Trump transition folks who got email addresses and devices signed off on that, but maybe they didn't have their readers. This little tiny print. Apparently, the way that Team Trump found out that Mueller's team has these thousands of emails from the transition is that members of the Trump transition team have gone in for interviews with Mueller, and they've been asked about these emails. That is how the Trump legal team has been surprised to discover that Mueller has got them. All of them. Thousands of them. So, Team Trump is having a little bit of a freak out around that issue right now, evidenced by these accusations that Mueller's team is acting unlawfully by obtaining these emails that Trump's team wrote on government-owned devices and from government email accounts. But this is just one of a number of stories that we've had break over the weekend and into this evening that tell you why the Trump White House may be having a difficult night right now. More ahead. Stay with us.
Loyalty, the Russians saying that he got rid of Comey for the investigation, and then this big cloud of Twitter and media attacks on various potential witnesses in the grand jury like Jim Comey and on the credibility of the FBI. If all of that is viewed as being intended to influence the grand jury, then that's a form of obstruction of justice. So it would be appalling if the Mueller team were not looking at all that evidence and trying to get to the bottom of how and whether obstruction of justice occurred.
Senator, do you believe the president will cooperate? How much can his legal team, for example, influence the nature of this interview with Mueller and his team, the format?
I don't think Bob Mueller and his team are going to be easy to intimidate. I think they're going to get what they want. Obviously, he's the president of the United States, and certain courtesies as to where you take the interview and as to what questions can be answered in writing as opposed to the ones that the prosecutors really want to see live is within Bob's discretion to let him have that flexibility, and I'm sure he'll be courteous in that respect. But none of that is going to inhibit Bob Mueller's ability to get the information that he needs.
Last Wednesday,
and by the way, when he's doing this, Now his witnesses, whether it's Sessions or Trump himself, are under pains and penalties of perjury. They're within the ambit of 18 U.S.C. 1001, the false statements law, and there is no executive privilege. So even the phony non-assertion assertions of executive privilege have to be swept aside. And if you're deliberately not remembering stuff, that also can create legal peril. So it's going to be harder for Sessions or for Trump to have fits of amnesia.
We've now learned that last Wednesday, the special counsel Robert Mueller and his investigators, they spent hours interviewing the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions. How significant is that?
Very significant. Again, it puts Sessions both the equivalent of under oath. It strips him of executive privilege, and it requires him to answer questions fully and truthfully. Second, there's just so much to go into about the obstruction of justice, about the firing of Comey, about what was going on with the meetings with the Russians back at the convention, which may well be related to the Trump efforts to strip, on behalf of Russia, the tough Ukraine provisions out of the Republican platform. Sessions was around long enough to know about that stuff if there was anything going on there. So there's a broad array of things that the Attorney General could have been talking about, and it could be that they'll get a second bite at him, too. Nothing says that these officials only get to be interviewed once.
As you know, Robert Mueller is also investigating possible collusion. Could the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, possibly answer whether others in the Trump campaign, and he was in the Trump campaign, Sessions, knew about this Russian offer of dirt, for example, on Hillary Clinton, an offer that was made to George Papadopoulos, who, as you know, has already pled guilty, a former Trump campaign staffer?
Yeah, absolutely. That and other things as well, given all the meetings that Sessions had with Russians, and given his ability, just from an investigative point of view, to point them in new directions and figure out who else they need to interview based on conversations or information that Sessions can report to them. So there's a good chance, actually, that this initial interview with Sessions was related just to obstruction of justice, and collusion may be a later interview. We just don't know what the topic was, but nothing says that everything had to be discussed in just one interview.
The Attorney General is also, if this were not enough, drawing scrutiny right now for reportedly pressuring the FBI Director Christopher Wray to clean house over at the FBI. What was the motivation behind that?
Well, it's hard to tell, but what looks really bad about this is that it aligns very closely with a lot of Republican talking points in the attack on the FBI that is being maintained, many of us believe falsely, as a screen to try to either deflect public attention from the Russia investigation or taint the reputation of the FBI in the Russia investigation with the public, or even to taint the image of the FBI with the grand jurors, to seek to influence the grand jury that way. Again, way out of bounds to be seeking to influence grand jurors in the performance of their duties that way.
The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, has drafted a memo accusing the FBI of abusing domestic surveillance tools, international surveillance tools. What would be the impact of that apparently 4-page memo's release?
Well, I suspect this is a bit of a amped up version of the document that Republican senators released asking for a criminal investigation into Christopher Steele, the researcher who put together the famous Steele dossier. It's a chance for political folks to take an issue that is buried in classified or investigative material and very selectively get portions of it out into the public domain without the public having a chance to understand the whole story. On the Senate side, we solved that when Chairman Feinstein put the whole story out, and I think that helped settle that question. It's more complicated because there's more information behind the Devin Nunes report. But the House members who've looked at it and who've looked at the underlying material say that it simply does not align with the actual classified material that it purports to summarize.
Yeah, Christopher Steele, not just the researcher, former British spy who apparently was pretty highly regarded by the FBI, by U.S. law enforcement, and the U.S. intelligence community.
Relied on frequently by the intelligence community and the law enforcement community for his expertise way before the dossier appeared.
Yeah, that's correct. All right, Senator Whitehouse, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's bring in CNN senior legal analyst Preet Bharara, who was fired from his job as the United States Attorney in New York by President Trump. Preet, thanks so much for joining us.
Good to be here.
Let's get to that Washington Post report, the story that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, plans to interview the president in the coming weeks, and that Mueller specifically wants to question the president about the firings of his national security advisor, Michael Flynn, and the former FBI director, James Comey. What does that tell you about the focus of this investigation?
Well, it tells you in part that the focus of the investigation is on the president of the United States, and in the preview in your question, you pointed to the two issues that they want to focus on if the report is to be believed. It also tells you it's a big deal. It's been reported for a while that ultimately the president was going to, that the special counsel's office was going to want to talk to the president, and these seem to be more concrete reports that that's going to happen. Now, typically, the timing would indicate that with at least respect to the things that they're concerned about that either implicate the president or about which the president may have information implicating others, they're possibly nearing the end. Now, nothing about this investigation is typical when you have a special counsel who has been appointed to investigate the activities of the president and his closest advisors. That's not a garden variety case, but I'll tell you from my experience in the U.S. Attorney's Office as the U.S. Attorney that when you have an overt investigation and people know what's going on, you saved for the end. In the same way that the FBI did with the Hillary Clinton email investigation, you save for the end sort of the top dog in the case. And so this would indicate, if it's true, by the way, and I caution people about necessarily believing the timetable that's laid out in that article, because it's probably coming from the defense lawyers, the people who are representing Donald Trump. But if it's to be believed that this interview might happen in the next few weeks, I think that's a considerable sign that we may be nearing some, important inflection point in the investigation and in the case.
The Washington Post is also reporting, Preet, that the president's team wants the testimony to be a sort of hybrid written statements and an in-person interview. How much influence will the president's legal team have in determining the format?
Yeah, so I don't know what that is, a hybrid. Generally speaking, prosecutors want, if they're demanding it, they want to speak face-to-face, sitting in a room across from the person they're trying to get information from. And, the defense lawyers and their associates can submit documents, they can submit affidavits, they can do presentations, but I would find it remarkable if it would be acceptable for the president's lawyers to say, with respect to some issues, we're going to give you a document and testimony in writing of some sort that's not sworn. And in some other cases, with respect to some other questions, we'll make the President of the United States available for questioning and follow-up back and forth. That doesn't seem to hold a lot of water, as far as I'm concerned.
Would it take place, the questioning of the President of the United States before a federal grand jury or in an office at the White House or an office at Mueller's Justice Department?
It could be any one of those things. I would say typically, from what I hear being reported from reports about the special counsel's conduct, in cases where you have a high-profile person who's very busy, who has other duties, and there's no more high-profile person in the country or in the world than the president, you make accommodations, and often the first thing you ask for is a voluntary interview. And that seems to have been the practice followed with respect to other potentially significant witnesses in the special counsel's investigation. So, again, this doesn't always work out this way, but typically the way we did it and the way I understand most people have done it is you make an offer to have a conversation that may be under oath, but typically because it's also a crime to lie to an FBI agent, whether or not you're under oath, sometimes you forego the oath. And people sometimes who testify in front of congressional committees also don't testify under oath when it's a voluntary type of situation. So I would imagine that in the first instance, as a matter of deference and courtesy, and to try to get the ball rolling, that the Mueller folks would be saying, you make the president available at a time that's generally convenient for him for a period of hours, and we'll come to you. I mean, we went to the offices of significant politicians and high-profile people too, just to get the meeting on the books and get it going.
Does it suggest to you, as it suggests to other people, that the Mueller investigation may be winding down if they're getting ready within the next few weeks to interview the President of the United States himself.
Yeah, well, I was saying a couple of minutes ago, I think that actually does indicate that may be true. And I know I keep using words like it may be true and lots of caveats because we don't know what's happened behind closed doors. We just found out in another report that you haven't mentioned yet that Jeff Sessions apparently underwent an interview at the hands of the special counsel's office, and we didn't hear about that for a week. So we don't really know what's going on. We don't really know what the status is other than these signals we get from occasional indictments, guilty pleas, and signaling of interviews that are taking place. But yes, the bottom line is the good bet is that they're nearing the end of some stage of the investigation, if it is true that there's a plan to interview the President of the United States in the near future.
And this notion that Robert Mueller and his team, they've been working obviously for months and months and months on this. They know a ton of information. They know a whole lot more than the public knows, that we knows, and they basically know the answer to every question they're getting ready to ask the President of the United States, and they want to make sure he tells the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Is that a fair assumption?
I think the first part of what you said is absolutely true, that the Mueller team knows a lot more than I know, than you know, and than the public knows, and that's as it should be. I think it's also generally the case that when you're interviewing someone at the conclusion of an investigation, and the reason you do this at the end is you want to be able to make sure you don't need two bites at the apple, right? So you collect all the information, you have the recollections of all sorts of other witnesses who were involved either in the firing of Jim Comey or whatever the situation was with Michael Flynn, or collusion with Russia, if that's proven or not. And having the benefit of all that information, you can ask more probing, pointed questions of who may be the ultimate target of the investigation. And so you don't have to talk to that person, then you find out information from some other witness a week later and wish you had asked a follow-up question of your main witness. It is not always the case, though, just to go back to your question, that you know the answer to everything. Like sometimes it's the case that part of the reason you do these interviews is not necessarily always to nail the person that you're interviewing, but also to see if that person has a more innocent or reasoned and reasonable explanation of what looks nefarious to the prosecutors. I mean, people forget this about what the job entails. Sometimes it entails giving people an opportunity to explain themselves. And sometimes when people take the opportunity to explain themselves, they dig themselves into a deeper hole. But on occasion, people sometimes will give you a reasonable explanation as to why you did something that's more innocent than guilty. So it's a combination of those things, I think.
I want to pick up what you just raised a moment or so ago about the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions. He was interviewed for hours by the special counsel last Wednesday. How important is his testimony to this overall investigation into possible obstruction of justice?
Well, that depends on what he says, and it depends on what he knew. I think that it makes sense for the Attorney General to have been interviewed, because as part of the investigation is about the nature and circumstances and reasoning behind the firing of Jim Comey. By all reports, Jeff Sessions, even though he recused himself from the Russia investigation, was involved in the decision and the process of terminating Jim Comey. That's relevant. The other thing it points out that I think is really interesting is, everyone understands that Donald Trump has been very angry at Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from the Russia investigation. Now we know, if the report is to be believed about his being interviewed last week, that Jeff Sessions is in fact a witness in the case, and the idea that he could have overseen an investigation where he, on the one hand, is the overseer, and on the other hand, actually has testimony that might be relevant to the investigation is completely untenable.
Sessions, as you know, during the campaign, he led the foreign policy team for Donald Trump. Could he possibly have answers to some questions, other questions, whether others in the campaign, for example, knew about the Russian offer to George Papadopoulos of dirt on Hillary Clinton?
Sure. I don't know. Yeah, I think anything is possible. I think anybody who is involved, it's another reason why he had to recuse himself from the Russia investigation. Anyone who is a close associate of the president, who was involved in a number of meetings, as we know that he was, whose recollection of the kinds of things that were said and who he met with has been at best sketchy and at worst, dodgy or outright false and misleading, is in a position to have information that could be damaging. And I think, Jeff Sessions understands, I presume, more than even other people, given his prior life as a United States attorney in Alabama, a member of the Senate, and now the Attorney General of the United States, with oversight of the FBI, mind you, what a big deal it is to tell a falsehood in connection with an investigation.
Why do you think the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, pressured the FBI Director, Christopher Wray, to clean house over at the FBI?
You know, I don't know. It could be innocent, and it could be because sometimes an institution needs a fresh start, and he has access to information that we don't know. On the other hand, given everything that we know about, you know, how the FBI has been functioning and partisan allegations that are being made from various corners, you worry a little bit about that. And I think it's the case that Chris Wray should be commended for trying to run his agency in an independent way, and not to be bullied around, even by somebody who on the organizational chart is ahead of him and above him. I think the FBI will retain credibility over time, notwithstanding pot shots that are being taken on particular things because people have a political interest on one side or the other. But it will retain credibility over time if the FBI director asserts himself as someone who is independent, knows what's best for the organization, and doesn't, at the slightest hint of partisanship, change his colors.
Bottom line, Preet, what's your sense about this investigation right now? Is it heading more toward obstruction of justice or Russian collusion, or as some have suggested, maybe money laundering?
Yes, I'm not going to predict, because people who predict get in trouble, because I understand this is being recorded, and I don't want my words to come back to haunt me. Look, I think that of those three things, we don't know a lot. A lot of it's submerged, as we've been talking about in this interview. But there has been a lot of information that has come out to suggest that the focus on obstruction is a very serious part of this. We also don't know if it's going to lead to anything at all. I mean, sometimes it's the case. This will be disappointing to some people and heartening to other people, depending on your political point of view. But sometimes you get to the end of an investigation and you have the final interview to check the box, even if you don't think there'll be an ultimate charge that you bring. That's how investigations are done. That's how investigations are supposed to be done. They're not supposed to be prejudged. They're not supposed to be a preordained result. And it may be that this will lead to something very significant and earth-shattering and earth-shaking for the country. It also could be that it's something that they're just putting to bed.
Preet Bharara's got a lot of experience in these areas. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Wolf.
All right, let's bring in our correspondents and analysts, and Gloria Borger.
I agree with everything you said.
Okay. It looks like it's getting to a climax right now if they're getting ready to talk to the President of the United States.
Well, as we've reported that the attorneys for the President and Team Mueller of the Special Counsel's Office have been communicating since around Christmas time and then now into the new year about just how to do this. It's kind of a dance, it was described to me, about how they can limit on the Trump side the liability, of course, for their client, and how Bob Mueller can get the information he wants. As Preet was saying before, if it were up to the Team Trump, they would just have some written interrogatories, whether they're sworn or whatever, and respond in writing. And then perhaps if that led to a very limited kind of questioning, say if they know the questions in advance, then maybe they would do that. I don't know where Team Mueller is on this. It would seem to me that at some point they would want to have a face-to-face interview with the president. Trump's team talks about Ronald Reagan and what happened during Iran-Contra, and Ronald Reagan gave written answers to questions during Iran-Contra, so they clearly would like that to happen. I don't know if that would be enough for Mueller. I kind of doubt it.
Appeared via video link before a federal grand jury.
That's what they would like to avoid. Can I just say that? Yeah.
Jeffrey Toobin, the Washington Post is reporting that Mueller wants to question the president in the coming weeks, specifically about the firings of Michael Flynn, his former national security advisor, and former FBI director James Comey. What does that tell you?
Well, that to me has always been the heart of the case, even more than collusion. Collusion is not a crime. The president's supporters have been pointing that out from day one. There are possibly crimes associated with involvement between the Trump campaign and Russia, but it is difficult to shoehorn that behavior, whatever it might be, into the criminal code. However, obstruction of justice is a crime that has often been associated with presidential scandals, whether it's Richard Nixon or Bill Clinton. And, the firing of James Comey alone, James Comey was investigating the people around the president and effectively the president himself. The president then fired him, as he later admitted, because of that investigation. That alone is very substantial evidence of obstruction of justice. Whether he lied about other aspects of that is also possible evidence of obstruction of justice. So, I mean, that remains, I think, the heart of this investigation. Whether it turns out that the Mueller and his team can prove it, either in an impeachment referral or in a criminal case, I don't know, but certainly that's what they're investigating.
Yeah, the president, in that interview with Lester Holt of NBC News, he publicly said he fired Comey because of the Russia investigation. Jim Sciutto, as you know, Michael Flynn, who was deeply involved in the campaign during the transition, and then for about a month or so became the national security advisor to the president before he was fired. He's now cooperating with the special counsel, Robert Mueller. He hasn't yet been sentenced. He's pled guilty. How risky is that for the president?
You know, it bears repeating, emphasizing. This is the president's former national security advisor who's pled guilty to a federal crime, who is cooperating with the special counsel. He's not he can't be dismissed as a coffee boy, as some of the administration have with George Papadopoulos, who's also cooperating. He was central during the campaign and in the transition, and he had a very senior role. And he is cooperating now at great, with tremendous incentive to cooperate, because he faces enormous, he faces the possibility of enormous fines. He already has enormous legal bills and possibly time in prison, and his son as well. And we know that was a driving factor in him cooperating here. So he has all that incentive to, one, speak the truth, but again, they wouldn't have given him that deal unless in his proffer he had shown them some value to the prosecution. That all spells potential trouble for the president and for senior people around him. And the other point I would make is this. You know, if it is true that the president is being questioned not just about Comey's firing, but also about Flynn's firing, that takes you back to the Russia investigation, right? Because Flynn was fired for lying about contacts with Russians. Obstruction of justice is clearly a focus here, and there is an obstruction piece to that, because we know that the president asked Comey about sort of letting Flynn go, but Flynn is also a direct line right back to where this started, which is Russia, contacts with Russians during the campaign, what was said during the transition, etc. I don't think we should imagine that that line of the investigation is necessarily shut off.
Yeah, let's not forget, David Swerdlick, it was, just 2 weeks ago that President Trump seemed to dramatically downplay the possibility of an interview with Mueller. Listen.
We'll see what happens. I mean, certainly I'll see what happens. But when they have no collusion, and nobody's found any collusion at any level, it seems unlikely that you'd even have an interview.
Seems, though, that Mueller is more interested in obstruction of justice than collusion.
Right. Well, the president's been going along that line because you've had various members of Congress on both sides of the aisle saying we haven't found anything yet on collusion. That's not the same as they haven't found anything. The investigation is not over. But yes, it's less about collusion, as Jeffrey was just saying a moment ago, which is not actually a crime in this context, and more about obstruction of justice, or just finding out what, if any, crimes at all were committed. I think when you talk about Flynn, Jeffrey, yeah, what you wanted to?
Well, Wolf, I mean, just, you know, that brief clip from the president, I think is going to demonstrate how difficult it will be to interview Donald Trump, especially under any of these scenarios. There's not going to be a judge there to insist that he answer a question. So he's going to filibuster. He's going to say, as he did in a recent interview, 16 times there was no collusion, regardless of what the questions are to him. You know, I just think, you know, the president is in a stronger position here than many of us may be thinking about, because he is in control. If he doesn't want to answer these questions, he's not going to answer them, and what's anybody going to do about it?
But he's really talking about no collusion in terms of himself. I mean, to Jim's point, and about Flynn's contacts with the Russians, that's not Donald Trump's issue unless he was involved. He knew about what Flynn was doing or gave him instructions. So, you know, there is that question, and I don't know what you would call it, whether you'd call it collusion or conspiracy. But, you know, when Donald Trump talks, he's talking about himself, not about anybody else.
Which is why I think they want to at least get him in there and get him on the record about the timeline of what he knew and when he knew it. If you look at the president's tweet from December where he said, I had to fire Flynn because he lied to the FBI and he lied to Vice President Pence, then that leads to a line of questioning that says, okay, well, when did you know, Mr. President, A, that General Flynn had talked to Ambassador Kislyak? And when did you know that Sally Yates had told John McGahn that this had taken place? When did you decide to fire him? And then why all this time, a year ago, did you not say that the FBI was the reason?
And the firing didn't happen until it broke out in the news, right?
Exactly.
Because the interview took place, I forget the number of days, 2-3 weeks before, but the decision was made only when it became public, not when apparently folks in the White House knew it happened.
Right. Wolf, can I say one more thing about Comey? In the case of Comey, right, we don't just have the infamous Lester Holt interview. You also have the letter that the president sent to James Comey firing him. He said, "I greatly appreciate you informing me on 3 occasions that I'm not under investigation, but I nevertheless concur with the decision that, you know, it's time for you to go." That to me is, you don't even have to guess at that. That's the first question, I think, for Special Counsel Mueller.
You know, Jeffrey Toobin, how significant is the fact that the Attorney General of the United States, Jeff Sessions, spent several hours last Wednesday answering questions from Robert Mueller and his team?
Well, again, it is evidence that I think the Mueller team is tending towards the end of its investigation. You know, as Preet said, you don't get many chances. You only usually get one chance to interview the very top people, like the Attorney General, like the President. So they would not have brought Jeff Sessions in unless they had all the evidence that they wanted to question him about. But he is a central figure. He is someone who has told inconsistent stories about his own involvement with the Russians during the campaign. In addition, he was intimately involved in the decision to fire James Comey. Both of those are big parts of Mueller's investigation, and you can see why there were hours of questions worth to ask. Everybody
stand by. There's much more we're following, including money in the Stormy Daniels saga. Was her alleged payoff by the president's lawyer illegal?
Aaron Burnett out front. Stories that matter.
You've got the money and you've got the passion, but how do you actually...
And Jeffrey, this could happen within the next few weeks.
It could, and it will be a defining moment of the Trump presidency. Presidents don't testify very often, and certainly we all remember that President Clinton said it depends on what the meaning of the word is during his testimony before Kenneth Starr, and certainly this will be as dramatic a confrontation. The terms of the deal are going to be tough negotiations, you know, whether it's under oath, whether there are cameras present, whether he has lawyers present. All of that needs to be worked out, as well as the president's lawyers' desire to have some of these questions in writing. I think that will be a complete non-starter with Mueller's office.
What do you think are some of the key questions Mueller wants to ask the president?
Well, I have thought from the beginning that the issue surrounding obstruction of justice, the firing of James Comey, is going to be the heart of this investigation. You know, the president's defenders have said from the beginning that there is no such crime as collusion, that is, collusion between the Russian government and the Trump campaign. And they're right. There is no such crime as collusion, although you could possibly shoehorn some other violations of federal statutes in there. There is no doubt that obstruction of justice is a crime, and Bill Clinton and Richard Nixon were both subject to impeachment investigations because of obstruction of justice. So I think much of the questioning will involve Michael Flynn's departure, the firing of James Comey, why that took place, whether there was any cover-up of the real reasons for those actions. That, I think, is going to be the heart of what Mueller's team is going to be asking about.
And it follows what else we learned today, namely that the Attorney General of the United States was questioned last week by Mueller's team. That's pretty extraordinary when you go right to the top of the Justice Department.
Well, he's a very important witness in this case at 2 levels, in part because he has given inconsistent answers himself about his connections as a member of the Trump campaign to the Russian government. So he certainly was going to be asked about that. But more importantly, he was a key player in the firing of James Comey, and he was a witness to those events. So that, I think, will be a very big part of, that was, I assume, a very big part of what he was asked about when he was interviewed.
You know, Laura, when he testified before Congress, the Attorney General, and we all heard the clips. He didn't remember this, couldn't remember that. Can you do that before the special counsel, Robert Mueller, and repeatedly suggest, I don't remember?
Well, that's not, you could do it. It's not going to be an effective tactic, because remember what their goal is. They probably already know every single answer to the questions they're already asking. You're not going to be an investigator and ask one question too many and have the truly open-ended, as if they're curious, quizzical people. Their goal here is to narrow down on what they already know, to box somebody in and check off the boxes they already are aware of. And remember, it's very important to think about this. Obstruction of justice may in fact be part of their inquiry, but they're trying to figure out why you were obstructing. What is it? What crime did you not want us to see? What are you covering up? We can't just pretend this is all going to be about what you did in the aftermath. Their focus is going to be beyond that. Why do you not want us to look in the corner of the room? What's there, Donald Trump?
You know, and as much as I've covered these kinds of investigations over the years, I can tell you that we think we might know a lot about this investigation. We don't. Yeah. What Mueller and his team knows right now is a ton of information that is not widely known and will be used as they go to this next level. Everybody stand by. There's a lot more coming up. We'll be right back.
Choose to go, to indulge your curiosity. Explore.
I mean, if you look at what the access he has, let me give you a couple questions. What has General Flynn offered, and what has he said about the president's and the White House's participation in conversations or authorization of conversations with the Russians? What kind of emails has the team, the FBI team under Mueller, acquired around the meeting, the famous meeting last June with Don Jr.? What kind of financial transactions have they reviewed between members of the Trump team and Russians or Russian intermediaries? There's a lot he knows. Let me give you one example. I'll go back to my career at the FBI, 30 seconds or less. I remember following a terrorism subject who was communicating in code with a terrorism recruiter in Europe. That subject was in a major U.S. city. That subject was researching how to build a backpack bomb, and that subject traveled to Washington, D.C. to research how to use a bomb potentially against the U.S. Capitol or other facilities. The U.S. public never knew about the case. So what I'm saying is they're acquiring a ton of information. Robert Mueller has never spoken. He won't speak until they determine what to say. He knows a lot.
Jeffrey Tubin,
can I just
go
add?
Ahead.
Well, just, you know, one area in particular, I think, Phil briefly alluded to this, is the whole financial side. You know, people have talked a lot in a very loose way that, oh, Trump has all these connections to Russia, and they gave him money, and he borrowed money, and he owes money to the Russians. I don't know any hard facts in that area. There have been even conflicting reports about whether Mueller has even subpoenaed Deutsche Bank, where both Donald Trump and Jared Kushner did a lot of banking. What those records show, if anything, regarding financial ties between Trump and Russia are enormously important, but it's not something that I think anyone who's followed this case really knows at this point.
It's a good point indeed. I'm sure they've got a lot of those financial records because money laundering has certainly been a subject of some discussion. You know, Laura, the current FBI director, Christopher Wray, we reported today, other news organizations have reported, despite the president's denial, that he actually threatened to quit, threatened to resign because he felt that the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was putting pressure from the White House on him to shake up his staff. That's a major, significant development.
It is, especially given the fact that at his own confirmation hearing, he talked about trying to resign if he was forced to do anything illegal or improper. And certainly accepting the fact that the FBI would somehow be a political puppet or marionette for the White House would be improper and a basis to do so. We haven't heard confirming reports from the White House that he, in fact, did threaten to resign. But the key here is understanding that this is an independent agency whose job it is not to act at the will of the executive branch, the White House. It's their job to actually pursue justice and whatever that means for them. You know, the decisions about McCabe, I'm always interested in hearing Phil's perspective on McCabe because
he's the deputy FBI director.
The thoughts about him maybe retiring and that may be one of the impetus, or maybe that he'll kind of force him out there. It's a bizarre thing you're talking about, but one that really shows that this Wray is trying to be independent.
And I wonder who told the president, because the president said it's not true, but I wonder if Sessions or somebody else may have told that to the president, or the president just said that because he wants to say it. But we'll see certainly what follows in the days ahead. Everybody stand by. There's more news. We're following a watchdog group lodges a formal complaint alleging a reported payment to a porn star was an illegal campaign contribution. to Donald Trump's presidential campaign.
Danish design is practical, honest.
What we try to do is make
about a sexual relationship with Donald Trump. Let's go to CNN's Brian Todd, who's with us right now. Brian, these questions are coming just as some prominent social and religious conservatives are giving the president a pass, apparently, on these allegations.
That's right, Wolf. Two evangelical leaders, Tony Perkins and Franklin Graham, say they're willing to overlook the Daniels story basically because they believe the president has delivered on their agenda. This comes as a liberal-leaning watchdog group claims that payment to Stormy Daniels was an illegal campaign contribution and is calling for a federal investigation. Tonight, the Stormy Daniels case presents a possible legal entanglement for President Trump. The left-leaning watchdog group Common Cause has lodged a complaint alleging that the reported $130,000 payment to Daniels in 2016 to keep silent about an alleged sexual relationship with Trump was an illegal campaign contribution arranged by Trump's attorney Michael Cohen.
I think this payment to Stormy Daniels was for the purpose of influencing the election. That makes it a contribution to the campaign and an expenditure by the campaign, given the involvement of Michael Cohen and presumably President Trump himself.
Common Cause wants the Federal Election Commission and the Justice Department to investigate. Common Cause says the timing of the alleged payment is crucial, that because Daniels was reportedly paid just weeks before the 2016 election and then stopped talking to media outlets around that time, the payment benefited Trump's presidential campaign and therefore was a campaign contribution. A contribution that, if it existed, would have exceeded limits on donations and also may have violated the law if it wasn't reported. Some campaign finance experts say it will be tough to prove it was a campaign-related expense because Trump might have paid Daniels even if he wasn't a candidate. Still, if the FEC ends up deposing key players in this drama, it could get messy.
To determine what the source of funds were, they have to gather facts, and that could involve a conversation with Cohen, that could involve a conversation with the Stormy Daniels. It could potentially involve a conversation with the president, all of which is not good.
Daniels, who appeared at a strip club in South Carolina this past weekend and apparently booked other appearances since the story broke, denies getting hush money. And both Daniels and Michael Cohen have denied the affair. Tonight, some influential leaders on the religious right are giving Trump a pass on the Daniels case.
We kind of gave him, all right, you get a mulligan. You get a do-over here.
Tony Perkins, leader of the Christian group the Family Research Council, says Trump is providing the leadership his movement needs.
Mr. President.
Evangelical leader Franklin Graham, who said Bill Clinton should resign over the Lewinsky affair, said the same thing on MSNBC.
We certainly don't hold him up as the pastor of this country, and he's not. But I appreciate the fact that the president does have a concern for Christian values.
Obviously, when Democrats crossed ethical lines, it was very easy for them to criticize Democrats, but they did make character an issue. That was one of the hallmarks of the evangelical Christian political movement. What they did with President Trump is decide to throw that all out the window.
Trump attorney Michael Cohen has never denied making a payment to Stormy Daniels, but he tells CNN that Common Cause complaint is, quote, baseless, as is the allegation that President Trump filed a false report with the Federal Election Commission. But if he did make a payment to Daniels, we had other questions for Cohen. Specifically, just where did the reported money paid to Daniels come from? From the Trump Organization, from Trump's personal funds, from the Trump campaign, or from a donor, or possibly from Michael Cohen himself? Cohen did not get back to us regarding those questions. Wolf?
You know, it's interesting, Brian, there was a very similar case involving another prominent politician, John Edwards, right?
That's right, Wolf. In 2012, John Edwards was prosecuted for secret payments his campaign donors made to his mistress in 2008 as he was running for president. But Edwards was not convicted. The jury found that the money spent for a candidate is not necessarily money spent for a campaign and is not regulated by campaign finance law, that it was a personal expense. People are giving this case against President Trump here a real long shot because of that precedent with John Edwards.
Very interesting indeed. All right, Brian, thanks very much. Brian Todd reporting. We're going to have much more on this story in our next hour as well. Also coming up, the breaking news. The special counsel's Russia probe closes in on the president and his inner circle. Robert Mueller is reportedly seeking to talk to the president in the weeks ahead. As CNN learns, his team has already met with the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, and the fired FBI Director, James Comey.
The FBI's investigation.
Over pressure from the top to oust senior staffers. Is the president trying to meddle with the Bureau and its Russia investigation? North Korea, even closer. The CIA director issues a stark new warning that Kim Jong-un is just months away from being able to attack the United States with nuclear weapons. What more can the Trump team do to protect and defend Americans? And firestorm. The White House facing questions about a porn star's alleged affair with Mr. Trump and whether the hush money she reportedly was paid was illegal. This, as some prominent Christian conservatives are ignoring the scandal. We want to welcome our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm Wolf Blitzer. You're in the Situation Room.
This is CNN Breaking News.
We're following multiple breaking stories in the Russia investigation tonight. The Washington Post reports that Special Counsel Robert Mueller is seeking to question President Trump in the coming weeks about his decisions to oust National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and FBI Director James Comey. This, as CNN confirms that Mueller's team has interviewed Comey as well as the Attorney General Jeff Sessions. There's a lot to cover this hour. I'll talk with former U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, who was fired by Mr. Trump, and Senate Judiciary Committee member Sheldon Whitehouse. And our correspondents and analysts are also standing by. First, let's go to CNN's chief national security correspondent, Jim Sciutto. Jim, Mueller's next big interview could be with the president.
That's right, Wolf. And if you look at the people who have been interviewed now or who will soon be interviewed, these names, Sessions, Comey, the president, if he agrees, it makes it very clear that a focus of the special counsel's investigation, very much on obstruction of justice. The president is on special counsel Robert Mueller's list for questioning, with Mueller planning to interview Mr. Trump in the coming weeks about his decision to fire National Security Advisor Michael Flynn
you betrayed your country,
and FBI Director James Comey, according to the Washington Post.
Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth?
CNN has learned that Mueller's team already interviewed Comey at the end of last year, according to a source familiar with the matter. Comey was asked about memos that he wrote on his interactions with the president before being fired. This, according to the New York Times, which first reported on the interview. CNN has also learned that Attorney General Jeff Sessions was questioned for several hours last Wednesday.
It's great to be here.
The first Trump cabinet secretary to be interviewed in the Mueller probe, and the 15th current or former Trump administration official. Today, the president said he is not worried about Sessions' meeting with Mueller's team.
I'm not at all concerned.
Topics of Sessions' questioning likely included Russian meddling in the election and, crucially, what Sessions knows about the president's decision to fire Comey, a matter that Mueller is investigating for obstruction of justice, according to a source close to Sessions.
I made a list of about 8 things that I think if I were Mueller, I'd want to speak to Sessions about, and obstruction surely is one of them, and perhaps foremost among them. How did it come to pass that Comey was asked for loyalty? How did it come to pass that Comey was fired?
New questions are also being raised about the Trump administration's interference with law enforcement. FBI Director Christopher Wray was pressured by the Attorney General to make staff changes at the FBI's senior level, according to a source familiar with the conversation.
It's one more example of this administration, the president and through his agent, the Attorney General, trying to interfere in the FBI's ability to follow the law and help with the investigation into the Russian interference in our elections and the possible collusion of the Trump administration or Trump campaign.
Sessions mentioned the Bureau's Deputy Director Andrew McCabe and its top lawyer James Baker, though it's not clear if Sessions explicitly told Wray to fire or reassign them. Baker was reassigned last year. Wray threatened to quit if McCabe was removed or reassigned from his post, appearing to follow through on a promise that he made at his confirmation hearing.
If the president asks you to do something unlawful or unethical, what do you say?
First, I would try to talk him out of it, and if that failed, I would resign.
Still, President Trump told reporters in the Oval Office today that Wray did not threaten to resign.
He didn't at all. He didn't. He did not even a little bit. Nope.
The president has repeatedly blasted the FBI, tweeting in December, after years of Comey with the phony and dishonest Clinton investigation and more running the FBI, its reputation is in tatters, worst in history. But fear not, we will bring it back to greatness. Some Republican lawmakers are focusing new criticism on the FBI for apparently losing a series of text messages between top FBI officials who've come under fire for criticizing then-candidate Donald Trump. Hundreds have already been made public. However, the Republican chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee dismissed the criticism.
That there may be a technical glitch at the Bureau. The fact that they have provided the rest of them certainly doesn't show an intent to try to withhold anything.
News that the special counsel wants to ask the president not just about the firing of James Comey, but also about the firing of Michael Flynn. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, Flynn ostensibly was fired for lying about his contacts with Russians. Wolf, that of course brings the investigation back to the question of Russia, not just a question of things that happened after Russia's meddling in the election. But another point, key as well, Flynn pled guilty to a federal crime. He is cooperating with the special counsel. What did Flynn tell the special counsel about his own dismissal, what the president said to him, and will the president's under oath testimony match up with that?
And they're looking very closely to see how much he cooperates, what kind of information he has. He hasn't yet been sentenced, and all of that is very, very relevant. Thanks very much, Jim Sciutto, reporting for us. Now over to the White House. The White House attempting to downplay and dismiss some of the fast-breaking new developments in the Russia probe. Let's go to our senior White House correspondent, Pamela Brown. Pamela, what are you hearing from the Trump administration tonight?
Well, Wolf, the press secretary, Sarah Sanders, has repeatedly said that there was no collusion, that the president didn't engage in collusion with the Russians. But it appears here that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, is zeroing in on obstruction of justice as it pertains to the president, not necessarily collusion. According to the Washington Post, Mueller has reached out to Trump's lawyers, asking to question him on two specific topics, as Jim just reported on, the firing of the former FBI director James Comey and former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Investigators want to know his state of mind, his intent. Why did he fire them? Was it to obstruct the Russia probe? As you'll recall, James Comey wrote in his memos that the president had asked him to drop the investigation into Michael Flynn. So Mueller's team will presumably want to find out why that is. But again, Sarah Sanders, the press secretary, is downplaying all of this, saying that the White House is fully cooperative, but that this should all wrap up soon. Here's what she said today during the press briefing.
As we've said probably just about every day this year since we've been here, that we're going to be fully cooperative with the special counsel, and we're going to continue to do that throughout the process. But we're also not going to comment on who may or may not or could be interviewed at any point, but we're going to continue to be fully cooperative with the process.
So while the White House clearly wants the Russia probe to wrap up soon, it is far from clear if that will happen. As we just learned, Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, was recently interviewed by Special Counsel Mueller's team. So clearly these interviews are ongoing. Now, what form the interview will take with the president and Mueller's team is still unclear. Sources say there could be a hybrid situation where he's interviewed in person as well as in written questioning. But certainly, if and when this happens, Wolf, it will be a significant development.
Certainly will be. All right, Pamela Brown over at the White House for us. Thank you. Joining us now, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He's a Democrat. He's a member of the Judiciary Committee. Thank you so much, Senator, for joining us.
Happy to.
All right, so the Washington Post now reporting that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, plans to interview President Trump in the coming weeks, particularly about his firings of his National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, and the FBI Director, James Comey. Is he building a case potentially for obstruction of justice?
Yeah, and probably has been for a long time now.
And you speak as a former Attorney General of Rhode Island. Tell us why you believe that.